Let's pretend.
They're probably getting their Halloween makeup set.
Probably standing right outside, not wanting to come in. And I don't blame them one bit. Okay, reality. Reality as far as, okay, so you get in trouble with the law. The probability of them having a jury trial, of you going to court, is fairly remote. Normally, instead of going to court, they negotiate. Everything is negotiated. So you won't have to go to court. This is one of the reasons why, when there is a court case, it's a big deal, and they televise, or not televise, well, sometimes they do. But they will, they talk about it a lot, about the court case. It wasn't very long ago that a policeman shot another policeman. An Asian police, this is in Albuquerque. I get all my news comes from Albuquerque. An Asian policeman shot an Anglo policeman. And somebody was dating somebody's wife or something. And I can't remember who was dating who. Anyway, it went to court. And of course, every day we got to hear what happened in court that day. Really kind of fascinating. There's a lot of crime in Albuquerque, a lot of crime in Gallup. But we don't hear about it very much because they negotiate what's going to happen next. So it never goes to trial. So usually what will happen is you will hear about the case maybe for a couple days, maybe for a week, and then you won't hear anything more. Then you'll find out what the sentence was. Well, they didn't have a court case, of course. It didn't go to court, but the lawyers negotiated. And there are lawyers that have been in the game for a really long time, and they've never been to court, despite the fact they're a defense lawyer or they're a prosecutor. They've never really gone to court. And so this is a big deal. This is a huge deal. Most cases are resolved through negotiation or by alternative dispute resolution. Very few cases are settled in trials. In 2009, only 1.2% of the federal civil cases were decided in a trial. And this is one of the reasons why of course all this is coming up right now because they just indicted Manafort and his accountant, right? Yeah, okay. That will go to court. That's going to be a jury trial. One of the things about Donald Trump, and I know I keep picking on the poor guy, but there are a lot of businessmen who never go to court. They negotiate everything. And part of his negotiation has to do with keeping everything secret. So because they can't divulge what the sentence or what the decision was, he can act like he won, because potentially I guess he did, because he was able to negotiate down or negotiate something in order to stay out of court. And a lot of people do this. A lot of, especially businessmen, will do this. In 2002, only 4.7% of the criminal cases involved a trial. So most of the cases, most of the drug cases, most of the assault cases, most of the rape cases actually never go to trial. It never sees a judge. It actually sees a judge, but it doesn't see a jury. Many cases are settled by negotiation without the assistance of a third party. In other words, it's just the two lawyers, the prosecuting lawyer and the defense lawyer. They will get together. They will make a decision. And we see this, if you've ever watched any of these things on television, we see this a lot. The defense attorney will have a relationship with the prosecuting attorney, and because of his reputation, because of that individual's reputation potentially, of course, they will settle out of court. And this happens a lot. This is one of the reasons why you'll get a high-power defense attorney, and this guy will go to court once or twice a year, rather than, and he takes hundreds of cases, but he negotiates most of them down. And that's the reason that he's successful, is because he has a reputation of being good at his job. Negotiation might be formal, as happens when management and union representatives negotiate a labor contract, or it may be informal, such as when there is a divorce. Two individuals trying to divide up the household goods. You really don't want the lawyer to decide who gets the dog. So probably what will happen is they'll just get together and they will negotiate. They'll negotiate terms. And of course, this is what happened with my daughter when she was trying to maintain custody of her son. They negotiated and they went into. But in that case, of course, because one of the individuals, the father of the child, was so negative about lawyers and whatnot, they had to bring in a third party, and the third party actually negotiated things. In the beginning, of course, he was screaming that he was not going to negotiate, that he wanted to go to trial, and the way that they were able to get him to negotiate was to separate him and my daughter. They put one in one room and one in the other room, and they never saw each other through the rest of the negotiation. It started out with him being very, very negative, and because of that, the arbitrator, the negotiator, removed them and put them in separate rooms. And then the negotiator would just talk to the lawyers, and they didn't really talk to the defendant and, well, one person and the other person. And they were able to get it done in a matter of 3 hours. It was only supposed to last for 2 hours. It lasted for 3, mainly because he was so negative about the whole process. Arbitration is one form of alternative dispute resolution. When the parties agree to binding arbitration, they agree to accept the decision of an arbiter. And of course, that's exactly what happened with my daughter and her former significant other. They had an arbiter, and because they had an arbiter, it was a little bit easier to negotiate. The lawyer that he had, the reason he was hired is because he always goes to trial. He always takes this to trial, so he always wins. And of course, if you go to trial, it costs a lot more money, and that's, of course, what he was trying to do. He was trying to outspend my daughter. And my daughter didn't have any money. She's a teacher in Florida. She only makes like $44,000 a year, living in one of the most expensive environments that you can possibly imagine. So she doesn't have any extra income. So all of her money came from us, my wife and I. We were the ones that financed the whole thing. If we hadn't done that, she would have lost. He would have won, because his family has a lot more money than my daughter does. Certainly a lot more than my daughter does. They have a lot more than we did, but of course since the arbiter was there, they were able to negotiate a fair settlement, a relatively fair settlement, and it only looks like it's going to cost about $10,000 to $15,000, which sounds like a lot of money, but that's about all the money we had saved. And we're both really old, so it's time to retire, and now our savings has just gone to the custody battle for my grandson, as sad as that is. So I'll be staying here and teaching for a lot longer than we had anticipated. When the parties agree to binding arbitration, they agree to accept the decision of the arbiter, of course. In non-binding arbitration, if one of the parties is dissatisfied with the arbiter's decision, that person may ask that the case be tried before a judge or a jury. And of course, that's what they were anticipating with the father of the child. He was claiming that no matter what the decisions were made, that he was going to go to trial. And of course, it didn't work out that way. And mainly it didn't work out that way because his mother pulled the plug on his unlimited resources. She said, $10,000 to $15,000 is as much money as I'm going to lend you, and it's over with. So just negotiate. You've already lost the case. They lost as soon as the judge decided that my daughter could move to Iowa. They knew that that was going to be the final decision. He was starting kindergarten. He would start in Iowa, and because he started in Iowa, then that was going to be the final decision. Not only that, but she had a much higher paying job. It was a much better, all the situation was much, much better. She had a house. She just lost her house in Florida. There's a huge backyard the size of a football field that the kid can play in. She gets $20,000 more a year in salary. It's a much more wholesome environment than Florida is. As far as raising children is concerned, because Florida has a lot of snowbirds, because they have a lot of elderly people, it's not a very good place to raise children. And Iowa, of course, doesn't have that problem. Who wants the snowbird in Iowa? Snowbirds. You've got snowbirds down here.
Yeah, Phoenix.
Phoenix does? Not here.
It's not in
But yeah. But if you get on 40, my God, you get behind them, you can't get around them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what happens especially.
So you just ram them until they get out. No. Not in my car, you don't.
Keeps them a legend.
I just run right underneath them, I'm afraid. Arbitration, whether binding or non-binding, uses trial-like procedures. The parties present evidence and argue the case, and the arbiter makes a decision. In recent years, arbitration has been criticized for being overly formal and time-consuming. And of course, as I told you, it took them 3 hours to arbitrate custody. The custody, of course, wasn't really in question. He really didn't want custody of the child. What he wanted was, he wanted him for every other weekend and select holidays. That's what he wanted. So he wanted to force her to stay in Florida, is what he was trying to do. And since she was allowed to leave and go to Iowa, that's out of the question. Now they have to negotiate. And what they were actually negotiating was who was going to fly the kid down to Florida. That's actually what they were trying to negotiate. The other question is, where were they going to fly into? The Quad Cities, Bettendorf, Davenport, Moline, and Rock Island, that's where we live, it has an airport. So he didn't want to fly into that airport. He wanted to fly into Chicago and then force Roxy to have to go to Chicago and pick up the kid. And that was part of the negotiation. Where would they fly into? I know, it sounds silly, doesn't it? It's just, 2.5 hours by car from Chicago to Clinton, Iowa. So it's possible. Anyway, they figured it out. They're going to split the cost of flying the child. A summary jury trial is like a conventional jury trial, though it's shorter. Lawyers tell jurors that what the witnesses would say if present. The lawyers argue the case and try to answer jurors' questions about the facts. The judge tells the jury what the law is and tries to answer jurors' questions about the law. The jurors then deliberate. This is the way that they do court-martials. They are summary jury trials. And usually the jury is made up of a group of your peers. So if you're an enlisted person, if you only have 1 or 2 stripes, then all the people on the jury have 1 or 2 stripes, just like you do. If you're an officer, then they are officers of the same ranks structure that you are. So if you're a captain, then they're all lieutenants and captains, first lieutenants and captains. And that's the way they do it. A summary jury trial, which is kind of interesting. My wife sat on several of these things, several courts martial when she was in the service. Always lots of stories. In recent years, verdicts from a summary jury trial have become binding and enforceable. Since it's a summary jury trial, it's like a pre-trial. Theoretically, it can be. But just recently, over the last 10 years or so, they've become more binding and more enforceable. So instead of holding trial after trial after trial for this individual, now they are allowing these to be binding situations. This process educates the lawyers and the clients on how a conventional jury might view the facts and the law. Once educated, the lawyers and their clients are more amenable to settling the case. And of course, that's really what they're trying to do. They're trying to to settle the case. So the reality is, it shows them what evidence is there and how a jury will accept that evidence or reject that evidence. So a summary trial would, before it was like a practice trial. Now, of course, it's far more binding. And what we see is having a summary trial and then them negotiating at the end of it. So the trial still stays intact. So the decision of the trial, of course, is the basis for the negotiation. Tends to be the basis of the negotiation. Mediation uses a neutral person, of course that's the mediator, to work with the litigants and their lawyers to achieve a settlement. The mediator does not have authority to decide the controversy, but rather acts as a facilitator, meeting with each party in an effort to broker an agreement. And of course, that's what was going on with my daughter and the father of her child. It was mediation. He was the individual was a mediator. It was kind of an interesting situation because, of course, my daughter's female. Hence the name, the word daughter. The other guy is a male, and usually a child is given to the female. In about 80% of the cases, the child is given to the female. In almost all cases. So it was really kind of a strange situation that he was fighting for custody. And like I said before, he wasn't really fighting for custody. What he was fighting for was more time with his son. And he was trying to get us to pay for all the travel between the two places. I know. He's a jackass. Anyway, it turned out the best possible way as far as we were concerned. It was about the best possible outcome. He was invited to visit the area. He could come up to Iowa and spend time with his son if he wanted, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted the kid to come down to Florida. Has no interest in visiting Iowa ever. Wouldn't that be terrible if my daughter wasn't willing to let the kid go down to Florida? I mean, it would have been a mess. Anyway, everything worked out okay, as far as we were concerned. People often prefer mediation because they are risk averse. They prefer controversies to be settled by them rather than decided for them. In other words, if you go to trial, it's the judge that decides what happens. So they would much rather be at least part of the process. Compared to litigated divorces, research suggests that mediation encourages parents to comply with divorce agreements, remain involved in their children's lives, and renegotiate relationships in a more adaptive way. Once upon a time, there was a president that ran on a platform that we need to do something about deadbeat dads. This was a huge part of his, well, you guys don't remember this guy, but he was running on a platform of doing something about deadbeat dads. He's going to put them all in jail, of course, which would have helped out just a ton. Since they're deadbeats, wait a minute, they're not paying child support, so we're going to put them in jail? Wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, because now they're not making any money and they can't pay any money. That didn't make any sense. I know it didn't make any sense. But of course the guy was trying to get people excited about this, because this was a horrible situation in the United States. We had all these deadbeat dads. And eventually he won the election, and he was president for 8 years. By golly, he was president for 8 years. And what do you think he did about being a deadbeat dad, about deadbeat dads? Nothing. Of course he didn't do anything. What can he do? That's all controlled by the state. Here he's the president of the United States. Yeah, he was running that he was going to do something about it. He did absolutely nothing about it. Because in essence, there's nothing he could do about it. It's state control. Divorce has very little to do with the federal government. Divorce doesn't have anything to do with the feds. It has to do with the state government. Sometimes it has to do with the local governments, depending on what state you're in. What form of ADR do people tend to favor? Participants favored options that offered them control. For example, a neutral third party helping disputants to arrive at their own resolutions and processes that allow disputants to control their own presentation of evidence. And of course, this is mainly what President Trump has done in his legal undertakings. He's always tried to press for a negotiator. If he could press for a negotiator, then he had some control over what was going to happen next. Should courts force litigants to try ADR before setting a case for trial? Attorneys like the process. They like this process because it means they don't have to go to court. If they go to court, then there's a lot more preparation. It also puts them on a stage. And you can be a lawyer without ever going to court. It's possible to do that without ever meeting a jury. It's the jury that scares lawyers to death. And the reason is because you never know what a jury is going to do. As long as you can write everything down, you're okay. One of the things they talk about is never ask a question unless you know what the answer is. That's as far as lawyers are concerned. Never ask a question unless you know the answer. You know what they're going to say. But of course, if we're dealing with somebody that you're a witness that you're talking to, that you're asking questions of, you never know what they're going to say next. You never know what the answer is going to be. So if you negotiate, of course, then everything is written down. The arguments are all written down, and because of that, you can control the process much better. It saves time. It also saves your client money, but they don't really care about saving the client money as much as they care about saving themselves time. This is where they make their money. If you understand how lawyers bill, they bill by the hour. So if they're sitting in their office thinking about your case, they can bill you. They can bill you for that. They can bill you for an hour's worth of work. Now, so how much are they charging? I'm not exactly sure what it is. Every lawyer is different, but it's usually somewhere around $100 an hour. Really? That much money just for thinking? Yes, that much money just for dealing with the client. If they file something, then they get an hour's worth of time. So anytime they're dealing with it, anytime they write anything down that deals with that case, anytime they file anything, they can bill another hour. And that's the way it works. However, mandatory ADR can lead to unintended effects. Some lawyers file meritless claims, knowing that their claims will have settlement value in mediation. So if it has value in mediation, of course, then all of this is billable. And because of that, they're just kind of running up the charge against the client. So like I said, the money, as far as the client's money is concerned, not that important. But if they can save themselves time, because every hour, every minute, in essence, is money for them. They're constantly making money. If they're just sitting in their office, they're potentially working on a case. And if they're working on that case, then they can bill the client for that hour that they sat there and wrote something down. Okay. But they don't care about the client's money. That's not the important thing. And of course, they can, as long as they're filing things, they can bill the client again. So they're filing all these meritless claims, and later on, of course, they can bring this up later. They can bring this up in negotiations, and because of this, then everything moves in the other direction. So they may get more stuff out of it, as far as their client is concerned. Okay, so we do have what we call problem-solving courts. They developed these courts because they were dealing with a lot of drug rehabilitation. And this was a real controversial situation. Now, I'm going to talk about rehabilitation, and we're going to talk about drug courts, but the reality is, are you ready for this? Okay, don't cry, don't start crying. One of the problems was that the reason they came up with these courts is because they had a lot of white kids that were being arrested for drugs, for marijuana, for opioids. And it was because of the white kids. I don't want you to have any illusion that it was because of the minority kids. It was because of the black kids that were doing drugs, because of the native kids that were going to jail. That's not it. It had to do with the white kids. And because of that, they started these courts. It's because the white kids were getting into trouble. I know. I had upset Curtis so much he's leaving. Okay. What's that? Oh, rehabilitation. Anyway, these courts don't put people in jail, but they allow people to go to rehabilitation. So a lot of times, this is what they will negotiate to get kids into these courts, rather than get into the criminal justice system. So anytime you've got somebody that's been pushing drugs, you've got a guy that was picked up for pushing pot on the elementary school in Gallup. What does he try to do? He tries to get his lawyer to negotiate going into one of these courts. That's what he's trying to do. He doesn't want to go to jail. If he goes to jail, he loses money, because time is money as far as he's concerned. He needs to sell more drugs. So he tries to get into one of these rehabilitation courts. And if he can do that, of course, then he can stay active. He just needs to go do whatever he needs to do, and he can still do all of the work, all of the pushing of drugs that he possibly can. So it has to do with rehabilitation rather than incarceration. And because of that, the better lawyer that you have, the more likely you'll get into one of these courts. And that's the way it works. So we see this all the time. We see people that probably should have been put in jail. The police make this wonderful case against a supplier, but instead of them going to jail, instead of them going to a jury trial, they negotiate down so that they go to one of these rehabilitation courts. So now we have that supplier, this guy that has $3 million worth of hydrocodone in his basement. We see this guy actually going to rehab. And in essence, he probably should have gone to jail. But it works. However, we also have that kid that this is a first-time offense. He needs to go to rehabilitation court. He needs to stop using drugs. So potentially we can get him into this court, and then maybe we can save him if we can send him to rehabilitation. All right. But unfortunately, his slot was taken by that supplier that is still out there doing business. There are three major justifications that have been offered for the development and expansion of such community alternatives. One is that they are humanitarian, certainly far more humanitarian, especially if we're talking about drugs, or we're talking about the mentally ill, or we're talking about a veteran with PTSD. They really don't need to be incarcerated for a year and a half. What they really need is people to try to help them. And those people are out there, and they are available. And the question is, will they get into one of these courts? Cost, it's much less expensive to do this instead of send the individual to a jury trial or even to negotiate. These courts are a lot less expensive. Correctional facilities house inmates who as a group have wide-ranging rehabilitation needs. And who was I talking to? I have a friend that lives in West Virginia, and he hooked up with a lady, and they've been hooked up for, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years now. They finally got married.
On farmersonly.com?
No, racistsonly.com, I think. Anyway, she's got 4 kids, and she had 4 kids. She's only got 3 now. But she's got 3 kids in jail. They're all in jail for one thing or another. Mostly they were ripped off by the system. But she has a son that she claims needs to go to rehabilitation. If they would put him in, and she actually got arrested for trying to smuggle drugs into the jail to give him because, he's so strung out. And she got arrested and thrown in jail for 6 months. I know, this sounds so stupid. Anyway, but the reality may be that he needs to go to rehab. But he can't get rehab because of the severity of his crime. He was robbing somebody, and he assaulted them and he injured them. So he had a choice between paying restitution or going to jail for an extended length of time. And because he didn't want to pay money, he decided that he would go to jail for an extended length of time. But then again, the reason he was trying to rob the guy was because he has a drug problem. And of course, once he got into jail, they negotiated all this stuff out. And once he went to jail, now he needs to go into rehabilitation, but he can't because of the severity of his crime. It has to do with assault. And the assault had to do with his drug problem. And he would have been okay if he hadn't injured the guy relatively severely. He's got a crystal meth problem. And he started hitting the guy, and he didn't stop. And he just beat him to a pulp, and he did brain damage. So if he had paid restitution, it would have been very expensive. And of course, it's an indigent family anyway. When populations are more homogeneous, as in mental health or drug treatment settings, and security concerns are fewer, than specialized and intensive treatment is more feasible. So if we are dealing with a group of individuals who have a mental illness, it's a little bit easier to send them to rehabilitation court. Or if we're dealing with a group of individuals with a drug problem. Now, if you send them to prison, of course, not everybody has a drug problem. So you're going to be dealing with people with a drug problem and people that don't have a drug problem. And you're going to be mixing those populations. And of course, once you mix those populations, they start interacting. Once they start interacting, the individual that has a problem with drugs now learns about criminal behavior at the same time because they're being incarcerated. So the reality is that it may be better just to send these people to rehabilitation court, these drug people to rehabilitation court. Because if we incarcerate them, they're going to learn more efficient criminal behavior, potentially. And that has been a problem in the past. A sequential INTERCEPT model, this was developed by Munetz and Griffin in 2006, identifies 5 stages of criminal justice process at which standard steps could be interrupted and a community treatment alternative substituted. And this is normally what happens. Normally the individual is arrested and we can send them to an alternative court at any of these junctures. And usually this has to do with negotiation. These are negotiated situations. INTERCEPT 1 is law enforcement and emergency services. When the individual with behavioral mental health disorders encounters any first responder, it can result in arrest, in criminal charges, in conviction, and incarceration. So if they're urinating in public, which happens from time to time, potentially they can be arrested, they can be charged with lots of different things. Exposure, with vandalism, they can charge them with a lot of things, and potentially they'll be convicted. And of course, if they are convicted, they'll probably send them to jail for a select amount of time. Only about 0.3% of police encounters are with people suffering from mental illness, but it is increasing, of course. Unfortunately, it is increasing. The homeless people, there are a lot of homeless people out there. I went to Walmart yesterday in Gallup, and there were like 5 people right there beside Carl's Jr., if you've ever been to Gallup. Right there beside Carl. I don't know why Carl's Jr. is so popular. I guess it hits the population going to Walmart. I'm not exactly sure, but they always sit right there, right beside Carl's Jr. You think somebody would shoo them away, but it hasn't happened. They seem to always be right there in Gallup. I don't go anyplace else in Gallup except for Walmart. Anyway, okay. And how many of these individuals are suffering from mental illness? Well, that's really hard to say. In some encounters, arrest is unnecessary. All they need to do is get them to move. However, with training, these incidents can be controlled instead of escalating into more dangerous situations. This can be a job for specialized police responding through crisis intervention teams In other words, instead of sending a cop down there to jack them up, we can send a crisis intervention team that can go down there to talk to them and try to convince them to do something else. Intercept 2, post-arrest, initial detention, initial hearing, and pretrial services. After an arrest has been made, the individual will be brought before a judge to determine if the crime is serious enough to warrant a trial. And this is usually has to do with first appearance. It's certainly their first appearance before this judge. Potentially it's their first appearance before any judge. At this point, if mental health intervention is more appropriate, the judges may remand the arrestee for mental health evaluation. Intervention can also take place when drugs are being used or domestic troubles are part of the problem. And a lot of times this is exactly what happens. Whether the individual has a mental illness or whether they have a drug problem and we're trying to rob somebody to get money for drugs, or whether they were arrested for popping their old lady or old man. Of course, you know, we can intercede right here. As soon as they see the judge can decide, well, we're going to remand you to a mental health facility to be evaluated. We're going to remand you to a drug rehabilitation center for evaluation. We're going to remand you to domestic violence court. And of course, that will keep it out of the criminal justice system. It will keep them out of jail. And of course, there may not be any reason to send them to jail, potentially. Intercept 3, post-initial hearings, jail, prison courts, forensic evaluations, and commitments. If the individual has a special problem that can be solved outside the criminal courts, they may see a specialized court, a drug court, a mental health court, a homeless court. They do have homeless courts, domestic violence courts, or community courts. They also have veterans courts, which are kind of interesting. The use of these courts to improve people's lives is called therapeutic jurisprudence. So instead of incarcerating everybody that is giving society problems, they can remand them to these courts. And then, of course, they can get the rehabilitation that they need. I was just talking to an individual. He has one of his grandchildren and his daughter are both in rehabilitation court. And both of them had been arrested at different times for different things, but both of them had been arrested, and it was determined that drugs were the problem. So instead of sending them to jail for an extended length of time, they sent them to rehabilitation. So now they're in rehab. Both of them are in rehab, and as it turns out, you can't just send them down there for a couple of weeks. If they're going to go to rehab, they have to stay there for 6 months, or 12 months, or 18 months, depending on how bad they are. And in other words, these individuals have been, both of them have been sent down to rehab. Initially for 6 months, but if it doesn't take over 6 months, they'll probably keep them there for a year. One of them is only 13 years old. He's got a drug problem. 13-year-old with a drug problem. Maybe this will help. Maybe this will fix it. The mother, and this is the boy's mother, the 13-year-old's mother, is in rehab as well. She had a crystal meth problem, and she wasn't taking care of her children. And so they were going to charge her with neglect because of the crappy way that she was taking care of her kids. But instead of doing that, instead of incarcerating her for an extended length of time, and the children becoming wards of the state, instead they sent her to rehab, and now she's down there for 6 months. And if she can clean up, then potentially she can come back and start taking care of her children again. Interesting situation. Therapeutic jurisprudence. So instead of incarcerating her, and when she gets out, she just goes back to crystal meth, now they're sending her to rehab, and potentially she'll come back and everything will be fine. And she'll start taking care of her children again. While she's down there, they're going to teach her an employable skill, theoretically. So we'll see what happens. The premise is that the legal system should help troubled individuals cope with their chronic problems that brought them into contact with the criminal justice system. So the question is, where are we going to intercede? At what point are we going to intercede? And if they've got a good lawyer, the lawyer will try to negotiate an alternative court so that they don't have to be incarcerated. The collaborative, non-adversarial nature of specialty courts in which judges work side by side with mental health professionals, community agencies, and offenders themselves focuses more on meeting the ongoing needs of participants than on punishing them. In other words, it's trying to rehabilitate the individuals. It's trying to make them functional members of society. As a drug user, potentially they're not. As a domestic violence, an individual that practices domestic violence, they're not a functioning member of society. As a veteran with PTSD that isn't functioning in society, if they do get into trouble, maybe we can send them to this court and we can get them the treatment that they actually need. This approach in which the law is used as a vehicle to improve people's lives is called therapeutic jurisprudence, and we talked about that before. Drug court diverts cases from the traditional criminal justice system and links drug-addicted offenders with treatment programs and extensive supervision. In exchange for successful completion of the program, the court may, for example, dismiss the original charge, so they don't have a charge on their record. So they've gone to rehab and they have done it successfully, and now, of course, that's going to go off their record. How successful are drug courts in reducing drug-related criminal activity? Now, we can all come up with scenarios where these individuals go into rehab and they aren't really rehabilitated, and they go right back to where they were before. And that seems to be what happens in about half the cases. The findings are encouraging, though some drug courts work better than others. A meta-analysis of 60 studies found that results were modest. Offenders assigned to drug court had a 45.5% recidivism rate. That's almost half of them are committing the same crimes again. 45.5%. For individuals that didn't go through drug court and didn't go through rehabilitation, recidivism rate was 54.5%. We can think of specific actors that have had this problem. The one that comes to mind right off the top of my head is Tim Allen. Tim Allen was arrested he was a pusher. He was a supplier. And he was arrested and he went to jail for 1.5 years. And when he came out of jail, he became an actor. He learned his acting skills in prison. And now, of course, Tim Allen is a fairly famous individual. We all think of him as Santa Claus because he was in the Santa Claus movies. There are 3 of them, I think. Anyway, but he was one individual that had committed a drug crime and was thrown in jail for not an extended length of time, but for 1.5 years. And when he came out, he didn't go back. There are a lot of actors that were actors, and then because they were famous, of course, they got into drugs. Johnny Depp is one of those individuals. Downey, what's Downey's? Robert Downey Jr. I was thinking Downey Jr. Yeah, Robert Downey Jr. He's actually gone back to rehab twice. But right now he's one of the most popular actors in the world. Johnny Depp, of course, is also one of the more popular actors. And these individuals have in Robert Downey Jr.'s case, he did slip back into drugs, but now he's clean, theoretically he's clean. Anyway, so we can see that this is relatively common. If we look at where drug courts are around the United States, they're mostly in highly populated areas. This is San Diego, San Francisco, San Diego and Los Angeles. This is San Francisco. This is the Seattle area. This is the Portland, Oregon area. Look at Kentucky. My God, what a mess. Look at all the drug courts in Kentucky. It's got more drug courts than anybody else. What's going on with those crazy hillbillies from Kentucky. Drugs that popular down there? Yeah, yeah. This is one of the more areas with the most opioid problems. It was right around the Cincinnati area. But look at West Virginia. The opioid problems in West Virginia are more severe than any place else in the United States. And look, no drug courts whatsoever. So what they're doing is just sending all these kids to jail, all these people that are found with drugs. New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore area, right there. Interesting, isn't it? Atlanta area, that's where Atlanta is right there. Where all the red dots are. Okay, interesting. Or not. The most successful drug, oh, wait a minute, I didn't even notice what was going on with Arizona. Flagstaff, Phoenix,
Holbrook.
Holbrook, that's Holbrook, isn't it? That is
Michael.
Holbrook. That is Holbrook. Yeah, okay,
Huge.
interesting. None on the reservation. It's kind of interesting. Okay, Phoenix though, Phoenix and Tacoma, I'm not Tacoma, Tucson, I'm sorry, and Flagstaff, all have drug courts. The most successful drug courts are those that excluded violent offenders. One of the problems that we see is that if we have drugs and plus any kind of violent offense, we have an individual that mixes the two together. So when they are doing drugs, they are also violent. And if that is the case, then we have to fix two problems instead of one. And as long as we can just fix the drug problem, we're far more successful. But if we have to fix the other problem, whatever this other problem may potentially be, why are they violent? Why when they use drugs are they violent? You know, we have to get to that. We're dealing with potentially a mental illness as well as a drug problem. If that is the case, they are much more difficult to deal with. If it's just a drug problem, we can talk them out of it. But if it's another problem on top of the drug problem, now we got a real serious, difficult situation. Worked with and treated offenders who had not yet entered a plea. These were individuals, of course, that since they hadn't entered a plea yet, when they went through rehabilitation, the charge was dropped. And because of that, they had a little bit more of a drive, a little bit more impetus for them to change. And these individuals were more likely to change. Employed well-qualified and competent staff who ensured that the program was delivered as designed and interacted positively with the participants. So the better the individuals doing the rehabilitation, of course, the more likely that they would be successful. One of the first drug programs that I was ever made contact with, the individual that was running the program was also supplying drugs to his clients. And he made lots and lots of money. This guy was making really big bucks. You know, we figured out what was going on, and we turned the tables on the guy. And of course, he was arrested, and then he became part of the program. As funny as that is, but sometimes you get a hold of bad people, or people that money's more important than fixing or helping people. And that was his situation. He just wanted to make money. He had money. He was a doctor, but he was supplying he was a physician's assistant is what he was. Anyway, we figured out what was going on. We made him stop. And then he was arrested in court with him.
That's the doctor?
No, this is somebody else. An immigrant from Barbados came into court on charges of arson. The man was delusional, thinking that he was the son of God, or he was sitting on the other side of Jesus because he was Jesus' brother. I'm not trying to say that he was. According to Christianity, you know, if you're a male, then you're the son of God, you know, that kind of thing. But no, he thought he was Jesus' brother. He had been hospitalized 9 times in 5 years. In a traditional court, he would of course pleaded guilty, and then he would have been incarcerated. In a mental health court, he was remanded to the custody of his mother, as long as he continued to take his medications. So he wasn't incarcerated, he didn't have a jury trial, he was remanded to his mother, and as long as he took his medication, everything was okay. But everything wasn't okay. Later, when the man complained of stomach problems, the judge signed off on a new medication and, of course, required the man to sign up for job training. Now we're trying to move him out of his mother's house. They allowed him to graduate from court. It only left with a misdemeanor. He was only left with a misdemeanor on his record, and it gave the man his cell phone number. The judge gave the man his cell phone number so that he could call him if he needed help. And of course, these two pictures have nothing to do with that. People from Barbados are normally of African descent, and that's the reason that this individual was black. Those are not even the same people, as you can see. I was just trying to find pictures that were representative. Okay. Deinstitutionalization, the long-term trend of closing mental hospitals and transferring care to community-based mental health treatment facilities, has left many mentally ill individuals without services or medication. This really pisses social workers off. This really pisses psychologists off. Once upon a time, there were mental hospitals in every state, and they were packed. They were full. And we got a president that decided that he didn't want to fund these damn things anymore because it was too expensive. So he closed them down and moved people into community health, mental health centers. Who was this famous president that closed all the mental hospitals down? It's not during your lifetime, it was before your lifetime. It was a very political move. What had happened in the 1960s, under John Kennedy, John Kennedy's sister had a mental illness, and because of that, he pressed for, before John Kennedy became president of the United States, you couldn't get any funding to help people with mental illness. There was no federal funding for it. After John Kennedy became president of the United States, he pressed for federal funding for mental illnesses because this was a really serious problem. We had all these mental hospitals and they were all full, and who was paying for it? Well, it was all indigent care. As it turned out, it was all indigent care. So he decided that what we needed to do, we needed to open more community mental health centers, and it needed to be funded by the federal government. So this is in early 1960s. Well, he was a Democrat, and sometimes issues like this become political, and this is one of the things that became political. It's kind of like the immigrant situation. Immigrant situation was one that needed to be dealt with, but the two parties decided that rather than deal with it, they'd fight over it, and now it became an issue. And of course, we just elected a president that wants to build a wall along the Mexican border, which is just fascinating to me. Anyway, so this became a political football, and the Democrats kept pushing for mental health funding, and the Republicans kept pushing against it. Finally, they elected a president that did away with everything that John Kennedy did as far as mental health was concerned, and he closed the hospitals. It was Ronald Reagan was the guy. Ronald Reagan was also the guy, of course, that was going to arrest all the deadbeat dads. He couldn't do anything about the deadbeat dads, but he could take away the federal funding from the mental hospitals, and that's exactly what he did. And once he took away the federal funding, they closed all those places. This is exactly what happened. Reagan became president of the United States, and they opened all the mental hospitals. And so what happened to all those people, well, not all those people, a lot of those people went to community mental health centers, and they were fine. Everything was okay. But some of them, of course, became the homeless. And they started living on the streets because nobody could handle them. Nobody could deal with them. If they had been institutionalized, they would have been taken care of. But of course, this is what happened. And it's really kind of an unfortunate situation. That mental health became a political football between the Republicans and the Democrats. And to this day, you can find Republicans that are really pissed off about that, about funding mental health in the United States. Just like There are Republicans that are pissed off about immigrants coming into the United States. So they're going to build a wall. I know, this becomes a political football, and you have to recognize the difference between what's really happening in political footballs. Because there's a lot of political footballs, there's a lot of stuff going on with Donald Trump. He raises a lot of issues, and because of that, it has changed the political climate in the United States. Some of these things become footballs. Some of these things keep being passed back and forth. And of course, we really need to deal with this. But instead of dealing with it, they become issues that nobody wants to deal with. And mental health, unfortunately, has been one of those. It's not anymore. The mental hospitals are all closed down. A lot of the community centers that were federally funded, of course, that costs the federal government money. They want to save all that federal money. So they've closed these community centers down. And this is really a serious problem. And that's one of the reasons why we have so many people with mental illnesses out on the streets. As a result, the mentally ill have experienced higher rates of homelessness, unemployment, alcohol and drug abuse, and physical and sexual abuse. These people that are mentally ill. They also experience high rates of incarceration. However, most local jails have treatment resources. Most local jails do have I'm not exactly sure what you guys have on the reservation. Anyway, this is really kind of interesting. They're talking about people living in dumpsters, and of course, dumpster's not a bad place to live if you don't have any place else to live. At least the wind can't get to you, right? It may smell bad, but then again, you smell bad anyway, so you haven't bathed in a while, so we don't have to worry about the smell. According to the criminalization hypothesis, a subset of mentally ill offenders committed and were arrested for offenses caused by their untreated symptoms of mental illness. And of course, I was talking about split in the last class. The guy suffering from dissociative identity disorder. He has a split personality. So is it his fault? What do you do with this guy? He's DID, and he's got a personality that commits crimes. If you remember at the beginning of the movie, if you've seen the movie, the beginning of the movie, they were talking about that only one of his personalities had a really serious problem. And that serious problem was having girls dance in front of him naked. That was his problem, if you remember. Did you see him dance at the end of the movie? I don't think I could do that. I don't think that was kind of cool. Anyway. So it's caused by their mental illness. Mental health courts were developed to decriminalize this population. So rather than send them to jail, which won't do anybody any good, it's certainly not going to help their mental stability, now we are sending them to treatment of one kind or another. If the offender is diverted, the mental health team prepares a treatment plan to lead to a long-term psychiatric care and reintegration into society. Close monitoring is essential with these select individuals. A lot of times, part of their problem and the reason that they're out on the street is because of paranoia. Really serious problem. They don't trust anybody. They don't believe anybody. They won't take their medication because they think it's poison. So they're paranoid. So they can be very difficult to deal with, especially the ones that are paranoid. The charges are dismissed if the offender follows the treatment plan, of course. Anyway, it gets really kind of interesting. If we're dealing with somebody with schizophrenia, in the old days they would have been hospitalized and they would have been put on a treatment plan until they were stabilized. Then they would have sent them home. Some individuals, no matter what you give them, no matter what you do for them, they are still too erratic to go home. So what do you do with these guys? In the old days, we would have kept them in the institution. It's not the best situation in the world, but it's what else can you do with them? They're paranoid. I have a friend that came to my Hogan the other day, and he said, My stepson has escaped from the nursing home. Stepson is 27 years old. He was in an automobile accident and now he has TBI. He has a very serious brain damage. He's functional, but he can't talk. And he's escaped from where he was. Now, what do you do with somebody who can't talk? What do you do with them? Well, you either keep them at home or you institutionalize them in one way or another. And in this case, the state was put him in a nursing home to be taken care of. And he escaped. You can escape from nursing homes. It happens all the time. Anyway, he's escaped. And he's been gone for 2 weeks. Nobody's been able to find him. Started down in Tucson. Everybody's looking for him. But if you, unless he can't talk, and he can barely understand what you say. He can talk, I'm sorry. He can repeat what you said. He has echolalia. But he can't tell you what he's thinking. He can only tell you what you just said. Okay. So unless somebody finds him, what's going to happen? You can hide, right? This is kind of a serious situation. Anyway. So maybe some people do need to be institutionalized. Anyway, if they follow their treatment plan, of course, then the case will be thrown out and it won't go against their record. They need to stay on their treatment plan. Now, not everybody, of course, we can deal with this way. If somebody has schizophrenia, this is a really serious situation. He has TBI, of course, and he's in a very serious situation. So what's going to happen? Somebody's paranoid. If somebody's paranoid, there's nothing you can do with them because they don't trust you.
Can you work into their delusion, kind of?
Wow.
Like try to get their connection to them like that way, and then talk to them
Hey,
in their own
and that will work.
their own delusion. I should say.
Right. But you have to use their delusion to control them.
Oh,
Ouch. Now, they really do have a reason to be paranoid because you're using their delusion against them. The other thing is that they won't tell you what their delusion is. If they tell you, then they lose control of it. If they lose control of it, now they're not in control of anything. Okay. So it's a sin. And they won't tell you because they don't want you to use it against them. And see how well paranoia works? It just keeps feeding itself. Yeah, it's kind of fun. Unless they've got a gun. Now we got a problem. Now we got a really serious problem. Remember the guy I told you that wants to shoot me if I ever go back to Indiana? And he's a deer hunter. So he's not going to shoot me he's not going to come up to me and pull the trigger. He's going to shoot me from a quarter mile away, is what he told me. I know. I haven't seen him on Facebook for about a year, so I think I'm okay. And I've been back to Indiana and I wasn't shot. Obviously I wasn't shot. Evaluations, but this is he's paranoid. And I told him he was paranoid, which is probably the worst thing I could have done. I kind of antagonized him. And now he's going to shoot me because I know he's paranoid. Are you getting the picture, Jeff? I'm a dead man, all right? It's because I identified this guy's paranoia. But I'm 68 years old. That's long enough to live, isn't it? That's a long time. I've lived a long and fun-packed life. Evaluations of mental health courts suggest that they have been moderately effective in linking individuals to treatment services and in reducing recidivism as long as the full dose of treatment is provided. And of course, this is the problem, making them go back every time they need to go back. One of the problems with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder, with a lot of problems, is that these individuals will take their medication until they feel like they're fixed, and then they'll stop taking their medication. Now, they go back into crisis. I know. This is a problem. This is a really serious problem. So you have to make sure that they maintain their program. And as long as you can get them through the entire program, then they will actually be fixed, if you can keep them on their medication. One of the problems with bipolar disorder, as I will tell you in my abnormal psych class, one of the problems with bipolar disorder is a lot of times these individuals commit suicide. And usually when they commit suicide, it's after they've gone off their medication. And they go off their medication because their medication makes them feel dull. Their medication won't allow them to have a manic episode. And when you have a manic episode, you have this amazing power. You have this amazing feeling. It's like being on speed. And because you give them this medication, it lowers that mania. And because of that, of course, they feel dull. Before, they had ups and downs. They had violent ups and relatively violent downs. And now that they're on their medication, now it's all about the same. They had black days and they had yellow days. And now all of a sudden it's blue or gray days. Wouldn't you much rather have a yellow day where you felt so damn good that you could conquer the world? Of course you would. And that's why they go for more. What time is it? Oh, I'm doing it. There are two concerns associated with mental health courts. Participants may feel coerced into participating. This is a problem, especially if they're paranoid. Jeff? Okay. You can't convert. If you coerce these individuals, they feel like they're being manipulated. And of course, they're paranoid. The second concern involves the selection of participants. There is a gender bias, and there is a racial bias. Most of the individuals that go to the mental health courts are white males, around 30 years old. So what's that telling an African American male who's 30 years old and trying to get into this court? And he can't get into the court because all of the slots are taken up with these pasty boys who are 30 years old. What they're telling them is that they're expendable people. And of course, that is a really serious problem. Perhaps the selection processes, rather than the interventions, account for the modest positive outcomes. Since these are all white people that are going to these courts, and since they're all middle class, then maybe that's one of the reasons why they're so successful. If we sent minorities to these courts, if we sent older people or younger people to these courts, maybe we wouldn't have the same success rate. But this is a fairly homogeneous group. They're almost all white males, as strange as that may seem. And maybe that's why they're being successful. And what is that telling the white population? That they're more important than everybody else. White privilege. Once again, white privilege rears its ugly head. Homeless courts are designed to reach out to marginalized individuals, and it addresses the underlying problems that resulted in their homelessness and regenerate these people into society, or reintegrate these people, regenerate. Now we're going to, I'm sorry, not the right word. We want to reintegrate them into society, the homeless people. These courts are typically held in shelters or agencies that serve this population, and because of that, of course, they are close to the population that they're trying to serve. Rather than being fined or taken into custody, participants in homeless courts are given alternative sentences, including assignment programs and activities. Employment training is one of the things we do for these individuals. We give them counseling, certainly. Alcoholics Anonymous meetings at this place, because sometimes this is the problem. And of course, we give them volunteer work to make them feel like they can do something. And this works. This really does work. Sometimes these people have fallen out of society, and all they need to do is to be reintegrated. And all of these things will bring them back. Potentially will bring them back. Especially the work. In recent years, domestic violence courts have coordinated efforts to hold perpetrators accountable, enhance victim and child safety, and promote informed judicial decision-making. And these are the domestic violence courts. Domestic violence courts differ from specialty courts. From other specialty courts, they start from the premise that the offender's behavior is learned rather than rooted in a treatable addiction or illness. So we can't treat them, but they have learned, they've been conditioned to do these kinds of things. These courts tend to be adversarial rather than therapeutic. The other courts are therapeutic, but this court is adversarial. You did it, and now you need to change, because we're not going to put up with that kind of stuff. They're adversarial, so they're telling these individuals not to do it anymore. Whereas the drug courts are trying to rehabilitate the individual, they're also telling them that they need to change, but they're not as adversarial. They're not telling them that they can, that it's going to be easy. They need to go to rehab in order to change. This court is adversarial. You did something wrong, and now you have to pay the consequences. Both victims and perpetrators express satisfaction with the court processes and outcomes. Perpetrators are more likely to comply with judge-ordered conditions. These courts are being controlled by judges, whereas the other courts are not always being controlled by high-level judges. These are the domestic violence courts. So the perpetrators like it better. Community courts are a neighborhood-focused court that is designed to address local problems such as vandalism, prostitution, shoplifting, vagrancy, etc. And they do have one of these, the community court in Albuquerque, because they talk about it all the time on the news, when I listen to the news. Participants generally like how they are treated in these courts. They use alternative sanctions. They feel that they're being treated more fairly than in traditional courts. So they like the community courts. Veterans courts. In a typical veterans court, a district attorney may opt to defer prosecution or offer a plea bargain to a reduced charge if it is clear that the offense was related to the veteran's disability. And there are actually a lot of veterans out there with PTSD, especially the ones that get into trouble. Vietnam veterans, about half of Vietnam veterans entered the court system for one reason or another. Usually it had to do with PTSD. About 50%, a little over 50% actually. So those people that were in Vietnam, and there were several million of us, 4 or 5 million of us, about half of them have been in the court system. Now that was Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam was 100 years. No, it wasn't. It was 45 years ago. It was a long time ago. It was a long time. It was long enough time ago that Burns has made a film about Vietnam. It was long enough ago that he's dealing with it. We're dealing with the same situation in Iraq and Afghanistan. All these veterans coming back from all this combat, we're going to see a lot of PTSD. And because of that, things are going to happen. They're going to do things, and we know that they're going to do things. And most of it is going to have to do with PTSD. There were a lot of drug problems after Vietnam. Potentially we're going to see the same thing from this group of veterans coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's going to be different, because Vietnam was during Vietnam, we were drafting people. Iraq and Afghanistan, we're not drafting anybody. These are mostly National Guard and reservists, as well as active duty, certainly. But we have it's a totally different population than we had before. In Vietnam, it was almost all draftees, and because of that, of course, it changed the dynamic. So we're going to see different things coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan. We're going to see more PTSD, and it's going to be different PTSD. Vietnam, of course, you were drafted, so you were a soldier. You were in the active duty military. You went to war. You came back, and then you left the service. you're in the service for 2 years. These individuals have been in for an extended length of time. They're used to going home at night, playing soldier during the day, and then going home at night, and here they were taken away from their families. So we're going to see a totally different situation, totally different dynamic. Offenders who are diverted to Veterans Court are less likely to reoffend than those whose cases go through the traditional criminal justice system, and there's a reason for that. And the reason has to do with the fact that they're being dealt with by other veterans. One of the things we know about PTSD, if you can stay around other veterans who understand what you've been through, then it's a little bit easier for you to deal with your life situations. People that stayed in the military after their combat experience, these individuals suffered less PTSD than individuals that didn't. And this is something that we understand. So if we can send them back to this court, then potentially we won't, they will not reoffend. One concern is that spatially courts are presided over by middle-class judges who reflect middle-class values and who may become inappropriately paternalistic in what they require of the people. Some have argued that problem-solving courts lack legitimacy because threatening punishment to coerce rehabilitation is unfair, and because guilt or innocence is not determined by a trial. Other problems, prosecutors feel pressured to favor rehabilitation of the offender over protection of the society, and defenders feel pressured to plead their clients guilty and to inform the court of their client's failure to comply with the terms of probation. Researchers worry that the lack of rigorous empirical studies that assess how specialty courts influence or fail to influence offenders of the conduct, and of course this is a potential problem. And I'll see you guys next week. That is the end of chapter 9, and as soon as I get through chapter 10, I'll make you up another test. I know you guys are all excited about that. That was chapter 9. This is the 11th week. I know you're as excited as I am. The semester's almost over. Christmas, Thanksgiving. I have all this work to do that I've been putting off all semester, and now I have to catch up. And whose fault is that? It must be mine, since I assigned all that work.
Are you going to open more article worksheets?
Sorry?
Are you going to open more article worksheets?
Yeah.
Because one has been 7.
7? Oh, so I need to open that. I didn't even realize that. Thank you for telling me. It's because of you that they're going to do it. I like that. So I'm not to blame this time. No, I won't tell anybody. It'll be a secret between the two of us and anybody else that's listening right now. I know, this is fun. This is too much fun.
I was actually doing an assignment for Sarah's class.